Let me call us together so that we give our panelists the full amount of time this afternoon. I'm William Graham, the dean here, and I'm delighted, in the name of the Divinity School and the Center for World Religions, you'll hear from its director in just a moment, and to welcome all of you, and of course on behalf of the Tanenbaum Center that I can't speak for, although I'm affiliated with this wonderful organization. I think it's a terrific thing that they've put together the celebration of the publication of this volume, Peacemakers in Action, under a panel on the same title, because I think the appropriate way to celebrate any publication is with an intellectual event that actually discusses the material in the publication. So I think this is an ideal occasion and topic, and I know that our panelists will also be here to participate in a closed academic conference over the next 24 hours, and I know everyone is looking forward to that who's involved in that. So I welcome all of you who are here for this afternoon's event and also those who are participating in the ongoing conference. It's a pleasure to have you all here at Harvard. I'll now turn things over to, is it next to Joyce or to Don? Who is?
Georgette.
Oh, Georgette, I apologize. I didn't know you were. I thought Joyce was going to be introducing tonight. So let me ask you to come forward as to represent the Tanenbaum Center, if you would, as its president.
Well, I feel very privileged to be one of the people representing the Tanenbaum Center here, and Dean Graham. I think it's wonderful that this event, which we are doing today under the auspices of several other hosts, is a continuation of a long-standing relationship that the Tanenbaum Center has had with the Harvard Divinity School, starting with Christer Stendahl, who is one of the founding members of our advisory board, as is Harvey Cox, who is going to be a participant in the conference. And we're very grateful to the hosts of the conference, to Mark Gopin, who happens to be the chairman of our Program Advisory Council on Religion and Conflict Resolution at the Tanenbaum Center, and to David Little, who also serves on that council and is also the editor of the book that we're here to discuss, and to Mark Gopin, who is I just said Mark, excuse me, who is the chairman of our advisory council. Joe Montville, who is going to be a participant in the conference and is also one of the members of our program advisory council. And also Donald Swearer, with whom we do not have the privilege of being affiliated yet, except through this program we're doing here today. Thank you so much for hosting this. We have a number of other friends who I'd like to acknowledge who are participants in this conference. Scott Appleby, who is one of our very important resource people at a working retreat that we had with our Peacemakers in Action in Amman, Jordan. David Smock at USIP, one of our panelists who did a wonderful book launch event for us in Washington, D.C. Two of our peacemakers on the panel, Jeheska Landau and Friar Ivo Markovich, and Ed Kaplan, who is a long-standing friend who is a participant in the conference. So I'm mentioning only those people with whom the Tanenbaum Center has a relationship, but we are so pleased to be joining the rest of you who I hope will become new friends of the Tanenbaum Center. The Tanenbaum Center was founded in 1992. I think that many of you are familiar with our work, so I'm not going to spend too much time in terms of giving an overview of our work, but we are very much focused on bridging the gap between scholarship and intervention. And that's one of the reasons that it's so fitting that we are here with you today. Our mission is to provide the practical programs that are so urgently needed to address unresolved verbal and physical conflicts that are based on religion. We work in 3 core areas. One of them is education, where we work with schools, primary grades, and also high schools. Workplaces, including corporations, healthcare facilities, law enforcement, where we deal with religion as a neglected aspect of diversity. But the program that is the one that is the most relevant for purposes of this panel today is our Religion and Conflict Resolution program, out of which this book emerged. Our problem that we addressed through this program was to find ways to make religion part of the solution to conflict instead of it always being the cause of conflict. And at a time where there are 50 conflicts being waged around the world as we sit here right now that are based at least in part on religion, that seemed to be a particularly apt issue to take on. How to make religion a resource in terms of addressing conflict. This was a natural outgrowth of some of the scholarly programs that we had put on. And you'll see as you look at the program for the conference that's taking place tomorrow that there's a very close connection. For example, a program that we did with the New School University on the religious roots of pluralism. A program that we did with the National Workshop on Religion, on authenticity and demonization. How can one be true to one's own religion without demonizing the other? So it's quite natural for us to flow out of those kinds of explorations into religion and conflict resolution, which at that time was pretty much virgin territory. So before deciding how the Tanenbaum Center would develop its particular contribution to the state of the art and what kinds of interventions to make, we worked with Columbia University and did a 15-part seminar to help to define the parameters of the field. And a number of the people who are sitting here today were actually part of that seminar. And the way we did that seminar was we took 5 of the world's major religions and devoted one seminar each to what it was about those religions that one could draw on in terms of conflict resolution. And then we also did 5 case studies where we took an area of armed conflict and explored, now how is it that a religion-based intervention might make a difference in that area? And then the rest of the sessions were devoted to learnings from that. We subsequently did a program with Princeton University, and it was out of that program that our first book emerged, Religion, Law, and the Role of Force. And what that seminar dealt with, I think, is self-evident from the title of the book. But then, looking at all of that, we created a very detailed grid to see where can we make a distinct contribution. What can we do that isn't being done already? And coming out of that analysis that we did of our tour d'horizon of what was going on in the field, we arrived at our Peacemakers in Action program. I have to say that we were given kind of a nudge forward by the person who actually came up with the idea for that program, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, who Friar Markovich, I think, will appreciate, especially for his role in negotiating the Dayton Accords, which at least was able to bring some kind of peace in the terrible conflict in the Balkans. And Dick Holbrooke's concept was that it was very important to look for religiously motivated individuals who were working on the ground, intervening in armed conflicts, and particularly important to find those who were relatively unknown, not the ones who had the big names, like Dick Holbrook himself did, who we honored a number of years ago, and not like the Dalai Lama, and not like Archbishop Tutu. I mean, everybody knows about those folks, but how important it would be to find the people like Yehezkel Landau and the people like Friar Markovich, who perhaps were not so well known outside of the areas where they were working, and to learn what were the techniques and modalities that they were using in intervening in conflicts, so we could come up with a real primer on how to use religion as a resource in track 2 diplomacy and intervening with armed conflicts. So it was out of that we have this. And this, I must put in this plug, is being sold immediately outside there. And I hope you will all avail yourself of that. So the distinct contribution that we found that we could make was to focus on the individual who was making a difference on the ground, to do case studies of those individuals, and the first 16 of those case studies appear in this book. And it's not that we invented the case study method. All of you in this room know that there are lots of case studies and that it's a method that's been around for a long time. However, in this particular field, up until now, the case studies have always focused on either institutions or organizations. And so the distinct contribution that is made by this book is to focus on the individuals who were making a difference on the ground. And I'm very pleased that today we're going to be hearing from some of those individuals and also from those who work with those individuals. And I thank all of you for your interest and for joining us today.
Now you can see me. I'm Joyce Dubinsky. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Tanenbaum Center, and I have the privilege of working with Georgette and with Scheherazade Jafari, my colleague who works in this program. I want to thank you for being here, and I'm delighted for two reasons. One, you guys are my target audience for this book. As you'll hear, I think that the findings are relevant for those who are being educated and those who are educating students of religion, because they can be our future religious leaders and our future peacemakers. I think we're also relevant for those who are being educated and those who are educating our future diplomats. And that's because our diplomats need to learn to work with religiously motivated grassroots leaders if we are going to change some of the conflicts that seem intractable and turn it around so that we can sustain peace. I think that Peacemakers in Action is going to be of interest to you. It tells the stories of 16 of our peacemakers, and it's relevant to this particular conference that's going to take place tomorrow. Each of them has a real vision of peace and reconciliation, and they get to it through their religious beliefs and their religious traditions. And they do it in real time, and they put their visions into practice. Now, as Georgette mentioned, when we started, we had a thesis that if we could find a way to identify the religious peacemakers, we would be able to do case studies of them, study their work, and learn from that what techniques they used. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. we were able to identify some techniques. Our criteria are really what Georgette was talking about. We looked for people who are religiously motivated, who are relatively unknown, who are prepared to put their lives or their freedom at risk, and who are working in the grassroots, trying to create peace, resolve conflict, and transform their societies. Today we have 24 peacemakers. The way we work with them is we convene them in working retreats. The first was in Amman. The second was in New York. The first with His Royal Highness Prince Hassan. The second in New York, where we met with the Dalai Lama briefly, and with his Peace Council. And the third will be in Sarajevo in October with Ivo, and we are looking forward to it. At those retreats, two things happen. One is we try to do practical work together. Practical, we've done trainings and fundraising, because some of our peacemakers are running small NGOs. We've done trainings in how do you work with the UN. We've done trainings in how do you deal with religious text and the negative text that comes out of your own tradition or another in peacemaking. We've also created a network. So the last time we were together, the peacemakers gave themselves a name. They call themselves the practitioners. We're the guys who are really doing it. And we're beginning to start seeing some opportunities for collaboration. Now, in studying their work, we've learned a great deal. And as I said, most of them are relatively unknown. How many here know Nozizwe Mablala Rutledge? Well, Nozi is of Zulu descent, and she comes from South Africa. She was a technician until she met Stephen Biko. And when she met him, she was going by a Christian name that she had been called in school. I believe it was Catherine. And he said, "What is your name?" And she said, "Catherine." And he said, "I asked you what your name was." And she said, "Catherine." And he said, "No, I asked you what your name was." And she said, "Nozizwe." And it was the beginning of her identifying as someone of Zulu descent with an identity of which to be proud. Today we call her Nozi, and she is an activist. She was an activist in the anti-apartheid movement, and for her trouble, she was jailed. Not once, not twice, but 3 times, and the third time she was put in solitary confinement for a year. That's what we call risk. Today, she's still an activist. She got involved in politics. She was there for I would call the Constitutional Convention in '91, where she helped to make sure that 50% of every team included women. And but I think the greatest coup was when she was named the Deputy Minister of Defense. A coup not because she was a woman, but because Nozizwe is also a Quaker and moved by her Quaker beliefs. So the first thought was, is this right? And the second was, how do I use this position to make change? And the way she made change in her society were to eliminate some of the institutional barriers for women, such as putting in sexual harassment policies so that they could serve, and trying very hard to see that the military didn't take over. Others of our peacemakers put themselves at risk all the time. It's in each of their stories. And once we meet the criteria, and we identify them, and we study them, and we meet with them, we learn a lot. Now, the piece that was hardest to write about in this book is trying to tell the reader what makes up a religious peacemaker. We were able to identify their techniques, and once again we did a very thorough analysis of every single technique each used, and then compared them across countries, because they come from all over, from El Salvador, South Africa, Nigeria, Sudan, Ethiopia, Israel, Palestine, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, West Papua. But there's something about their person, something about who they are. Part of it comes from the fact that they're moved by religion, that their religions define them. But when we tried to parse it out, what we also discovered was that there was a quality in each of them that was different. They could not tolerate injustice. It was as if they had to go do something about it immediately. And we think that that was really because of the way they look at the other. And they see the humanity and the divinity in the other. We also found that they were very emotionally gifted. You know, multiple types of intelligences? Well, they're off the chart on emotional intelligence to a person, and intellectually gifted. And fear had no place, because when there was injustice, it had to be addressed. So those were the qualities that made up these people. And then there were the techniques that they used. And those techniques were across the different countries and across the different religious traditions and across the different conflicts. They're all detailed in the book. I'm not going to go through all of them because I want to be mindful of time, but a few. One was that because of their religious role and the identification of them as grassroots religious leaders in their community, these individuals were very often seen as authentic and fair, not necessarily neutral, although there's a discussion about that between the editor and some of us, but definitely fair, just, and they had stature in the community. They were able to use religious text and adapt it for peacemaking. They could talk about forgiveness in a way that others could not. They could also use religious text in totally new ways. So in Afghanistan, Sakina Yaqubi, during the time of the Taliban, she had hidden schools for girls and women. And what she was using was the Quran to teach literacy and to teach the women and the girls that Islam valued them and meant that they were to be respected. And then she'd work with them on how they would go home to their husbands and brothers, and how they would then talk about what the Quran really said, not what the Taliban said it said. We saw the power of the pulpit being used. We saw Chencho Alas, by a sermon that he gave, getting a court to reopen a decision with 400 peasants marching on the court for justice. We see Abuna Shakur, now the Archbishop in the Galilee, doing peace education. And look, he's created at Mar Elias a school that has Palestinians, Christians, Jews, Druze, and Israeli Arabs in the school, K through university today. But if you go to his school, and I've had the privilege of being there, and you drive up and you get to the school on top of a mountain, he's built a church. And the steps of the church had the Beatitudes on them. Why? Because that's what moved him always in his religious work and in his peacemaking. And it's in 4 languages on the steps. It's in Hebrew, it's in Arabic, it's in French, and it's in English. And if you go through the chapel to the big assembly room behind, there is a huge wall. And on that wall, there's a picture of Martin Luther King and Gandhi and the crescent and the Jewish star and the cross. These are our peacemakers. So when you ask, where are the voices of vision? Where's the healing? Who are the people who are taking higher values? and putting them into practice, I think the answer is it's religiously motivated individuals working on the ground, ready to do that no matter what the risk. There's a lot to be learned from them. Their footsteps can be followed. And beyond that, there's a lot to be learned. So we learn to use them, to work with them, and to let them be a resource in track to diplomacy, so that we look for new ways of finding solutions and new ways of using religion as a resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. My name's Susan Hackley. I'm the managing director of the program on negotiation, which is just a couple of blocks over on the Harvard Law School campus. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Donald, for inviting me. And it's wonderful to have heard from Georgette and Joyce about their work in helping produce this really remarkable book. I've so enjoyed reading parts of it the last several days. I just want to say one thing about the program on negotiation, because it relates to what we're going to hear from our panelists today in this whole work, and that is it's a program that's existed for 25 years. It's one of the first ever really developed to explore the field of conflict resolution as a field. And what I see the Peacemakers doing in these wonderful chapters is a kind of negotiating. They're negotiating with governments, with people within their own organizations, with people in their communities, with military, with people behind the table and across the table. And there's so much of what they describe in their work that we talk about in conflict resolution, building coalitions, how you're going to frame a problem, looking for problem solving, strategies, win-win rather than win-lose. And we honor someone every year as a great negotiator. Richard Holbrooke one year was an honoree. And typically these great negotiators say, well, they never studied it. They just kind of figured it out as they went along. And I think that might be the case with our Peacemakers here. But it's such a pleasure to be here. Program on negotiation is multidisciplinary: law, business, psychology, anthropology, public policy, education. But we haven't made enough connections with the Divinity School, so it's really such a pleasure to be doing that today. And several of my colleagues are here from the program on negotiation. So what we're going to do, we're going to hear first from two of the honorees, two of the 16 who are described so eloquently in these chapters. Then we're going to hear from David Little, the editor of the book, and David Smock from the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I want to get going right away so we get to hear from all of them and then have time at the end for your questions. So just very briefly, I hope you all have the page with the biographical information. There's some up here in the corner if you don't have it. But just very briefly about Friar Ivo Markovic, one of the peacemakers celebrated in the book. He's from Bosnia-Herzegovina. He studied at the theological faculty for Franciscans in Sarajevo. He's been a teacher, a writer, an activist, a bridge builder, has done multiple of courageous acts in his community. And just interestingly, one thing he's done that he's gotten a lot of, there's been a lot of interest in, is creating an interreligious choir, people from warring factions and different faiths coming together through the arts. So that's wonderful. And we look forward to hearing from you, Friar.
Thank you. Thank you, Georgette, Joyce, Mr. Little, Scheherazade, all people from Tanenbaum Center for this privilege to have opportunity to be on this promotion. It was very persistent and dedicated work during 10 years to watch closely the peacemakers in the world whose work was stimulated and inspired by challenge of social disorder and war. On the book is written that David Little is editor. I don't agree. I think Tanenbaum Center with David Steele, they are authors. They are authors because they are researching, looking for spiritual and theoretical backgrounds of the people who receive this award, Peacemakers in Action. I'm one of these people in action, and I like this expression, this syntagma, in action. Personally, always I prefer to be in action than to be too theoretical in theoreticism. Probably because I was born in Catholic Christianity with prevailed tendencies, spiritual tendencies. I experience it as far of life, armchair theory, escaping from atrocious pains, needs, and problems of our world. Later, I discovered that such my orientation comes also from my Franciscan spirituality. In the novel The Name of the Rose of Umberto Eco, a Franciscan explains his research in action orientation just with these words. Probably because I am Franciscan. I like it. I was asked of my Franciscan leadership to dedicate my life to science, to be professor, teacher. I agreed under one condition, always to stay engaged in community and in social life. I could confess my life orientation, my life decision, always to be inspired of powerless, poor, on deprived people, of their needs and compassion with them. A balance between spirituality and action is really crucially important for human life. I come from one country where was a communistic ideology, and the fight and communism collapsed just on wrong solution of relation between spirituality and action, theory and praxis. The solution they proclaimed as dogma was unity of theory in praxis. In praxis, it was possibility each misuse to justify with any theory. So, because I'm Christian, Franciscan, it is very interesting the relation of theory and praxis, spirituality and action by Jesus Christ. It is forgotten. Jesus first worked, acted, helped people, healed them, protected, took them from deprived and humiliating situation. He didn't talk about his theory, spirituality. He witnessed it. But his actions were not without theory, without spirituality. His spirituality came from experience of love of God. Later, after people experienced his positive change, their positive change of their lives, they asked and looked for explanation where this spirituality came from. You like examples how we work, what we do in Bosnia. I would tell you just on one example which happened last week. Thursday evening in Sarajevo was organized one concert of one Croatian Catholic Humanitarian Association. Leader of it is one Catholic priest. They invited one Croatian singer, Marko Perković, nicknamed Thompson. Thompson is brand for gun. It is one gun. He confesses himself as good Catholic, good Croat. He sang the songs mobilizing Croats in the war. He was sometimes very anti-Judaistic. And his concerts were forbidden in Netherlands. Many Catholic bishops and priests said in publicity that they listened to his songs, support him, and so they also invited him to sing on Christians' meeting concerts. When I took his songs to listen to it, listening to these words, music, I was really ashamed to listen to it. I could understand that one spiritual man, human being, can't listen to such music. Sarajevo last week was full of panels for this concert. On the panas was cross made of one sword. On the top of the sword was a coat of arms of Saint Benedict, who founded Europe. There was also rosary over it, and one tag making cross. On the tag was written Thompson. T-H-E, it associates to Theos in Greek language, son, and MP. Do you understand? Marko Perković, it is name of the singer, son of God. This design was on CDs of this singer, both of Croatian, so many priests, bishops. So when I saw it, I wrote one protest and invited some priests in Sarajevo to subscribe it, and all of them subscribed it, and so we alarmed publicity because there were injured Christian symbols, and it was very alarming. The newspapers wrote about it, radio, TVs, so it was very strong alarm and tensions in Catholic Church. It was very dangerous concept because these songs are full of national passions, which awake also national passions by Muslims, Bosniaks, and Orthodox Serbs. And so they have to give up of such concepts. So it is one example how we live in what is the situation now in Bosnia, and what is peace. Peace is a process to enable that life functions. So this book is one Peacemakers in Action, is one, I find, sketch edition. In human history, it was most popular. It were most popular books, collection of lives of saints, of Caesars. So such books are predecessors of encyclopedias. And also today people like to read such books. Yellow print, misuses such books. And I find that in this book are people who were compelled of the situation to be sincere, who felt mission challenging from this situation. They had to answer to it, and really I find it could be inspiring book in the world we live. Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the second of the Peacemakers in Action, who's described in the book and who is here today, Yehezkel Landau, now a faculty associate in interfaith relations at Hartford Seminary, where he was telling me he's had the opportunity to do many things he couldn't do in his years in the Middle East, and perhaps he'll talk about that. He is a dual Israeli-American citizen, has a degree from Harvard Divinity School, very committed. Had to put that in. Very committed to Jewish-Arab peacemaking. Was co-founder of Open House, a really remarkable project described in this book, which took one piece of contested property in Israel-Palestine that was claimed by two different families, and through joint ownership and joint management has made it into a kind of peace center, which really is remarkable. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks, everybody. Please forgive my hoarseness and the fact that because of my challenged physical situation, I'm going to sit here. All right? It's an honor, a delight, a pleasure to be in such special company in this book and on this panel today, and in this room, which has rich, heartening memories for me, especially when it all looked that way. I remember Dick Niebuhr giving a talk I was an undergraduate at the time, and I took his course on Kant, Coleridge, and Schleiermacher. And I've become a Schleiermacher devotee ever since, also with the help of Albert Blackwell. And he was giving just an amazing talk, and there was a bell that rang just at a crucial moment, and he referred to the bell ringing in such a beautifully integrated way that I'll never forget that. That's one of those Kairos moments in the Sperry room. Okay, in the few moments I have, I want to go backwards. I'm going to rewind my videotape. Because Susan just mentioned my present position at Hartford Seminary, which is 5 years old, and I'm grateful to the Henry Luce Foundation for underwriting it, at least for another 2 years, does allow me to do interfaith education and reflection and writing that I wasn't able to do in about 25 years in Jerusalem. I say this very sadly, and I see myself as a kind of shaliach, an emissary from Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies, the holiest place there is, to a place, at the moment it's Hartford Seminary, another kind of laboratory for bringing Jews, Christians, and Muslims together. It is not so politically charged or even polluted as the Holy Land is, which gives some opportunity to act and reflect on that action in a different way than I was accustomed to for 24, 25 years. And one of the blessings or bonuses right now, this is how God writes straight with crooked lines. I just finished 13 weeks of teaching a course on Job and Jonah, Ayub and Yunus in the Quran, to Christian and Muslim students. 6 of the 7 Muslims in the class are very devout women from Damascus, Syria, who are now doing a master's program in Christian-Muslim relations. And I was the first Jew they ever met. And this interaction has enriched our lives and will continue to enrich our lives and may bring me in Mark Copen's footsteps to Damascus. We'll see. Okay, so that's just one example. The other thing I should mention is that I get a chance 2 weeks a year to direct an interfaith education laboratory called Building Abrahamic Partnerships. And you can read about that on the web and in a brochure, so I won't make reference to that. I'll just say that this is an experiential learning community of 8 to 10 Christians, 8 to 10 Muslims, 8 to 10 Jews, who are in a total immersion environment for 1 week. And as you may know, that in the Middle East, food is the lubricant for anything else that happens. So we have catered kosher halal meals, which is the foundation for everything that gets talked around the food. Yummy. Okay. Enough about Hartford Seminary. One step back on the webpage. I'm into triangles. The Abrahamic triangle is my special graphic image for making shalom, wholeness, out of the fragmented Abrahamic family. So, Open House, this laboratory in Ramla, Israel, was established by 3 families of the 3 faiths. 2 families who actually lived in this house in Ramla, between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, not Ramallah, Palestine, West Bank, but Ramla, Israel. Excuse me. The 2 families, a Muslim-Palestinian family named Al-Khairi, and the Jewish family, Ashkenazi Landau. My former wife, Dahlia, grew up in that house. It was her childhood home. And after she inherited it, when her 2 parents died, and we were married then, we met the Al-Khairis and worked out this vision of having it serve as a dual-purpose community center, an affirmative action preschool for Arab toddlers, like a Head Start program, and a coexistence education center. It still functions. Open House actually was never closed for 1 day. It's remained open through intifadas and terror attacks with great pain, and transforming that pain into greater compassion, we've managed to keep children and parents and teachers and civic leaders in touch with each other as allies and not as adversaries. You can check this out on the web, friendsofopenhouse.org, and there's a new book that the journalist Sandy Tolan has written for Bloomsbury Press called The Lemon Tree, which tells the story of these 2 families and the one symbolic home that stands for a homeland of two peoples who can't seem to share it equitably and peaceably yet. Okay. The three families were the Muslim Palestinian family, our Jewish family, and a Christian Anglican Israeli Palestinian family named Fanus, who were the third corner of the triangle when we founded it in 1991. And in reflecting on my biblical heritage and these foundational stories, especially in the book of Genesis and in the Quran, it says in Genesis 12, Abraham is promised that through him all the families of the earth shall be blessed. It doesn't say they'll all merge into one family called Ben or Bat Abraham, a child of Abraham. They can be called Fanus, Ashkenazi, Al-Khairi, and they can still be Abrahamic siblings with distinct identities. So that's what Open House is as a micro-laboratory within Israel and Palestine, a micro-geographic laboratory, which I understand biblically for the practice of justice and compassion. Those are the two virtues associated with Abraham and with God. And obviously in a state of war, our spiritualities are distorted, even contaminated, certainly skewed, and it's extremely difficult to keep on track, to keep our, what I call a hierarchy of holiness straight. For example, life is holier than territory. Territory should be sacrificed, not just conceded or relinquished. Sacrificed, I use that term, a religious term, territory should be sacrificed for the sake of ending war and injustice. That to me is a religious imperative, a command from God. If you don't follow that, and you think the land is holy by virtue of your controlling it, then you practice the sin I would call territorialatry, which I think is simply sin. Okay, let me go back one step further. That was my life and work in the 1990s. In the 1980s, I was directing the staff of the religious Zionist peace movement called Oz V'Shalom, Nitivot Shalom. Oz V'Shalom, strength and peace, from the last verse of Psalm 29. Nitivot Shalom, from Proverbs, all the Torah's paths are peace. Chol v'nitivoteh shalom. And this was two small movements of religious Zionists, one formed in 1975 and the other in the Lebanon War of 1982, that eventually merged as a third point in this triangle, another triangle, between the secular left in Israel, which includes Jews and Arabs, who are humanistically bonded, but religiously not really resonating, and religiously zealous people and movements, primarily Jewish and Muslim. But in the Jewish community, this religious Zionist peace movement stood between Peace Now on the secular left and the Gush Emunim settlers on the religious right, trying to create an authentic Jewish Torah-based synthesis, recognizing the land is holy, but justice, peace, and human life are even holier, and we have to get our priorities straight. And the National Religious Party, for example, was not helping us. The Settler Party says, the land of Israel for the people of Israel according to the Torah of Israel. Have it all. In the real world, it doesn't work. So you have to make certain priorities and certain compromises. So for us, we have to allow a Palestinian state to emerge and Jerusalem as a Holy Mother city to be shared, not monopolized, not dominated by any tradition, in order for what we call the Holy Land to really be consecrated. Otherwise, we will continue, God forbid, to desecrate it through the suffering and death and destruction of many people. Okay. So that was my work in the 1980s. And just to stress this point about life holier than land, I have a weekly booster shot on the Sabbath for the preemptive inoculation against territoriality, which was the consecration of the Sabbath as the first thing made holy by the Creator. Before there was a holy land, a holy city, capital of the Jewish tribes in David's time, a holy shrine, or the Temple Mount, the Haram Sharif. Before anything was consecrated in space, God made the Sabbath holy. We sing this in the Kiddush, blessing over the wine or grape juice every Friday night. God blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. First reference to holiness in the creation story. And I believe that if we could, and that's why Sabbath observance made it into God's top 10, not David Letterman's. God's top 10 remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, or observe the Sabbath day in Deuteronomy 5. Remember and observe, because by doing that, by linking up to the holiness of the cosmos, which relativizes all territorial claims, 1 day a week, you can, no guarantee, but it helps get your perspective straight. So the other 6 days, when you're building tabernacles or temples or making a project at Hartford Seminary or trying to create an open house or whatever you're trying to do, you will know experientially, spiritually, deeply, once a week at least, who's in charge. Letting go of your own ego attachments, even to good things, and letting God be the creator and redeemer. So when we say Shabbat Shalom from toward the end of the week until Saturday night, it means on this Shabbat, may you feel, may you know deeply the messianic promise built into the creation, encoded in this sabbatical rhythm of sevens through all the sabbatical cycles that God, our one creator, has blessed us with. Last thing I want to say, just in terms of blessing, I echo what Joyce said. I think it was Joyce or Georgette. That it is a revelation to discover the face of God in the other, especially your adversary, or that the person or persons defined nationalistically or politically as your enemies. That they bear the divine image no less than you, in a different way, but no less than you. And that is an important shift in consciousness and in the heart center that allows for a real metanoia, a real transformation of your whole being toward reconciliation. Because so long as you're kept in these dualistic scripts, especially victim and vindication scripts, nothing is going to move, not in you either. And if we want to have individuals be movers and shakers and active peacemakers, like this man, who's a music man too, then we have to find languages of the heart to really bring people together. I was in Sarajevo before I met you. When I left, this was in 1998, when Monsignor Matozovkic brought me there for the first Catholic Jewish colloquium. So I was very intrigued by what you said. It was such a glum place then. I wondered if I were waking up in Sarajevo every day and not in Jerusalem, could I do my work? I was in Belfast twice, and look what just happened in Belfast. Unbelievable. Alhamdulillah, Baruch Hashem, that Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness could share power in Belfast. It's like, wake me up. No, it's not a dream. It's really happening. So, why can't we have a truth and reconciliation process in the Holy Land? It can happen. It will happen. We just have to make it happen with God's help. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're going to hear from David Little, who has been so instrumental in making this book happen. He's a visiting professor here at Harvard Divinity School and a former senior scholar at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington. He's written many books and articles, including the book with Scott Hibbard, Islamic Activism and Foreign Policy. And he is the editor of Peacemakers in Action. David.
Thanks very much. I'll just sit here as well. I'm going to speak very briefly, and I'll save time by not going to the podium. I begin by expressing my deepest thanks to Georgette, Joyce, and Scheherazade, and the other remarkable members of the Tanenbaum staff. Ivo Markovich is right. This book is the product of a communal effort, of which I played one part, but these people and the staff at Tanenbaum were really to be congratulated for first conceiving of this book and then providing the support, the continuing work necessary to bring the book to fruition. And it's because of them, really, that we can hold the book in our hands this evening. May I say, too, that this book, as Georgette was commenting, is a token of the many-sided and very innovative work that the Tanenbaum Center does in the field of religious peacemaking and understanding. The subject of this book came about, it seems to me, namely the connection between religion and peace. The subject is illustrated by the collapse of the former Soviet Union. That is to say, when the former Soviet Union collapsed, there was a negative impact with respect to the role of religion and a positive impact. The negative impact is all too familiar to many of us, the influence in places like Bosnia, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Israel, Palestine, the negative impact of religion on ethno-religious conflict. As a matter of fact, the religious impact on those conflicts was taking place during the time of the Cold War, but no one noticed because our eyes were all focused on the overarching conflict between East and West. It was with the fall of the Soviet Union that we began to look with alarm at the impact that religion was having, unfortunately, both on ethno-religious conflict and, as we've become more and more aware in recent years, on the rise of religiously oriented terrorism. So there's the negative side, which unfortunately haunts all of us and this book as well. Without that negative side, the seriousness and the importance of the work done by the individuals represented in this book would not have been made possible. Thankfully, there is a positive side as well. I have in mind the role of religion, the constructive role of religion in places like East Germany and Poland, where religiously oriented groups with a strong nonviolent perspective had obviously an enormous impact upon helping those societies move from being closed and having authoritarian administrations to relatively open and more democratic forms of government. I also have in mind the Philippines and South Africa, again strongly authoritarian regimes whose orientation again was based upon the premise that resisting communism is fundamentally important. When communism fell as a significant force, these countries began to turn away from that rigid authoritarianism, move in a much more constructive, open, democratic direction, and the role of religion in the peacemaking activities in both those countries was enormous. So that the constructive impact on world politics of religion came out in many ways just as strongly after the 80s and early 90s. And it's in that tradition, that constructive, that positive tradition, that this book clearly stands. At the heart of the mission of the Tanenbaum Center is the work of individuals such as are represented here. And the major point that this book is making, and it seems to me the fundamental contribution that it makes, is that religion is not just about bloody borders and clashes of civilization, to use the language of my colleague and former teaching partner Sam Huntington here at Harvard. Nor is it, by the way, just about the violent threat of religion or the pernicious influence of religion in the spirit of people like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris. There is, of course, that to be said, and no one denies it, but it's surely religion is not just about those things, and a book like this makes that point very impressively and very effectively indeed. In my estimation, this is a book of the highest quality, and it succeeds in communicating the stories of these 16 remarkable individuals with the power and clarity that those stories deserve. Incidentally, also included in this book, and very worthy of mention, is the set of background orientations for the conflicts that these individuals are involved in. An overview, historical, demographic, etc., is provided in each case. And again, people who've read the book have told me that has been enormously helpful in setting the scene in which these individuals are working. It's all very well, as most of us here in this room do, to pronounce on theory and to wax eloquent in that direction, but it's a very different thing for people actually, as Ivo Markovic and Yehezkel have indicated, to put into practice on the ground the kind of theoretical insights that many of us deal in as a matter of trade. There's very little of the easy idealism, the speculative flights of fancy that are sometimes characteristic of academic work in this area. These peacemakers have walked the walk, and they've gained, I think, the right to talk the talk, and we, I believe, are obliged to listen to them. In my summary chapter, in which I try to knit together basic themes that at least occurred to me as central to the work of these people, I've drawn 7 lessons, and I'd like to close by reporting those lessons to you. Religion neither causes violence by itself, nor, on the other hand, is it without influence, particularly in its extremist form, on the course and character of violence. 2, religion is not just a source of violent conflict, but also a source of peace. 3, proper religion exhibits a preference for pursuing peace by peaceful means, that is, nonviolence over violence, and for combining the promotion of peace with the promotion of justice, a very important theme that recurs throughout each of these individual stories. 4, religion dedicated to promoting peace and justice by peaceful means often prompts hostile and violent response, at least in the short run. No easy stories here. These people have paid a price, paid a very high cost for the work that they have engaged in. 5, hostility and violence are best overcome morally and most likely practically by favoring the promotion of justice and peace by peaceful means and by willingly bearing the risks and costs associated with such activity. 6, because of their innovative efforts in places like Afghanistan and South Africa to overcome gender-based and political injustice and conflict by means of assertive nonviolence, women are a particularly important resource for peace. We only have 2 women among the 16, Nozizwe, who was mentioned, and Sakina Yakubi, an Afghani Muslim woman. But it is the intention of the Tanenbaum Center to increase largely the number of women who will be in the future included in this. We have 3 more now, according to Georgette. 4. Well, 3 or 4.
1 more.
7, the last lesson drawn by me, whether and how force may be used in the proper pursuit of peace is unresolved so far as the testimony in this book goes. That is, the group is somewhat divided on the total abstinence in respect to the use of force or its measured use. And this remains, it seems to me, an important problem for the peacemaking community to continue to reflect on. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. And then for our final presenter, David Smock, who is currently the Vice President of the U.S. Institute of Peace Center for Mediation and Conflict Resolution, and he's Associate Vice President of the Religion and Peacemaking Program, one of the USIP's Centers of Innovation. He has served as Director of the USIP's Grant Program and Coordinator of Africa Activities, worked on African issues for more than 30 years, lived in Africa for 11 years. Thank you so much.
Well, my connection to the book is more remote than the other contributors to this discussion, but I have 2 connections. One is Cambridge University Press, before they decided to publish it, sent it to me and said, "Should we publish this?" And I gave it a very strong endorsement, so I feel I played some role in getting it published. Secondly, many of the people highlighted in this book and profiled are my partners working in religious peacemaking in various parts of the world. And I thought what I would do would be just to make a couple of comments about those partners, telling you things that are not in the book, that things they have done that we have done together in recent years after the book was finally written. First, with Yehezkel, he was too modest to mention this publication, but Healing the Holy Land, Interreligious Peace Building in Israel and Palestine, which is available on the USIP website. But it's a summary of religious peacemaking and peace building in the Holy Land that Yehezkel did, and a very fine piece of work that we are proud that we were able to publish it. James and Ashafa, the pastor and the imam from Nigeria, have been my close partners for the last several years. And a couple of things that we have done together that are not profiled in the book. The end of February, we co-sponsored what we called a religious summit, which brought together top Muslim and Christian leaders in Nigeria to get them to pledge to work with their flocks to dampen down violence during the elections. And the elections took place last month. They were violent, but they were less violent than they might have been if we hadn't worked with the religious leaders. But more dramatically than that, a couple of years ago, I read in the newspaper that in a place called Yowa in Plateau State, 1,000 people had been killed in Muslim-Christian fighting. And I contacted James and Ashafa and I said, do you think you could offer yourselves as mediators there? They went to the governor of Plateau State, who had failed in mediation efforts. They went to the people, offered themselves as mediators, and they were warmly embraced. And they did background research on the causes of the conflict. And I went out to join them. And for a week, we mediated between the Christians and Muslim leaders in this community. And I won't tell you the whole story, but the dramatic moment came when the Christians had identified the principal source of objection to the way the Muslims had treated them that triggered much of the conflict. And that was about the way the Muslims had treated the Christian chief in that village. And the Christian leader went on at great length about all the terrible things that the Muslims had done and castigated them up and down. And James and Ashafa all this time were mediating, and one of the high points was their religious exhortation, where they were quoting from the religious text. But what was most remarkable was that James, the evangelical pastor, was quoting from the Quran, and Ashafa, the very conservative imam, was quoting from the Bible, and back and forth, demonstrating their own commitments to interfaith peacemaking and lifting up their own stories of how they had changed from religious warriors, where James had lost his right arm in fighting and the imam had had 2 of his cousins killed in a battle where they were fighting each other, and that had become peacemakers together. But the Christian leader laid out all these complaints, and the Muslim leader finally stood up to respond, and he was quiet for quite a while, painfully long silence. And then he said, you know, we did all those things. We committed all those transgressions and sins. And we apologize. And we ask your forgiveness. And what could the Christian community do, priding themselves on those who offer forgiveness first, but say in return, we forgive you as well? And over the next 3 days of mediation and consultation, all the different complaints that the 2 communities had made against each other were resolved either through an agreement or a methodology set up to move toward an agreement for resolution. I was sitting on the periphery of this discussion. This was James and Ashafa, who were profiled in the book, who did this wonderful work. Menachem Froman. Mark Open, who is here, introduced me to Menachem Froman first. Mark had met Yasser Arafat before. I had not, but it was Menachem Froman, the chief rabbi of Tekoa settlement in the West Bank, who took me for the first time to meet Yasser Arafat, and they treated each other like long-lost brothers. Froman told me once later, he said, you know, I don't believe in reincarnation, but my wife does, and she thinks that in an earlier incarnation, Yasser and I were really brothers. And more recently, Menachem, and it is described in the book, the role he played in establishing the Alexandria process that we have been very heavily engaged in since January of 2002, have been the principal international partners for the Alexandria process, along with Canon Andrew White. But after the Hamas election victory in the Palestinian Authority, it was Menachem who had the longest-term relationship with religious leaders among Hamas. He had visited Sheikh Yassin, the spiritual leader of Hamas, in prison several times before he was assassinated. And at one point, he and Yassin had said to Menachem, if it was left to us, we could settle this whole problem in about 5 minutes. And one of the themes that runs through all these stories of interfaith peacemaking is that people of different faiths, even faiths that have been in hostile relations with each other, because they share a faith commitment, Yassin and Menachem were able to have a bond. And more recently, with the Hamas victory, Menachem has had continuing dialogue, much to the chagrin of the Israeli government. He has offered to open channels of communication for the Israeli government with the Hamas leadership. And this is a man who is the chief rabbi of a settlement in the West Bank. The other thing I would mention very briefly is I think I could be part author of your next book, because there are more recent peacemakers in action who have been chosen who are worthy of similar profiles but have been selected after this book was written. Betty Bagombe, who was a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace now for 10 years, has been mediating between the Ugandan government and the Lord's Resistance Army, the so-called religiously motivated movement in northern Uganda. The Lord's Resistance Army, the only platform they have is that they're going to live by the Ten Commandments, but they rape and they kill and they shoot and they slaughter and they maim, all in the name of Christianity. It's a terrible, terrible story. And Betty has been the most effective intermediary between the Lord's Resistance Army and the Angolan and the Ugandan government. She comes from that part of Uganda and continues to be an advisor to the current mediators and to promote a reconciliation process there. Andrew White, whom I mentioned briefly, who has been the mainstay of the Alexandria process between Israelis and Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and also heroically working in Iraq, and we've been trying to help him in organizing a summit between Sunni and Shia leaders in Iraq. And it has been a very traumatic process of trying to get this organized. And originally it was going to be held in the UK, and the people in the neighborhood around where it was to be held in the conference center said, we'll only allow it to happen here if you give us police protection, and the British weren't prepared to give police protection. And it was going to be in Rome, and the Italians finally vetoed it. It was going to be in Malta, and the Maltese finally said, we can't do it here. So now it's being organized in Baghdad, even though some of the participants who are in exile will not be able to participate. But Andrew has been a hero in all of this work, and we've been proud and privileged to be his partner. And Azhar Hussain, who works to reform madrasas in Pakistan. We have just co-sponsored a workshop in Islamabad for madrasa leaders, for imams, both Sunni and Shia, as a means of bringing Sunni and Shia together for peacemaking in that land where Sunni and Shia are at such odds with each other. And we're engaged in a process to offer new curricular materials on tolerance, on pluralism, on gender equality. And Azhar has been our partner in that. And my colleague, the Pakistani-American Kamar al-Huda, has been working on that. So I'm anticipating the next book. This one is well worth buying, but the next one is going to be really good too. This book, as has been mentioned by several, lifts up the role of individuals. And that is one of its unique contributions, is lifting up the role of individuals. The downside of that is it's easy to forget the kind of institutional support that stands behind individuals. Individuals are critical, particularly in this lonely business of religious peacemaking. But we can't underestimate the importance of institutions and local partners who lift up and support this work. Just finally, a couple of lessons that can be drawn from these stories and also from my own work. That religious leaders need to work with secular leaders. They really can't do it alone. They have a unique role to play, a very important and often neglected role, but they need to work with secular leaders as well. The Catholic lay organization Sant'Egidio that led the mediation that led to the peace agreement, the end of the civil war in Mozambique in 1991. Their greatest virtue, to me, as I watched that peace process and have seen it documented and reflected upon, Sant'Egidio knew what they didn't know. That was their greatest gift to peace. They were able to bring the parties together. Nobody else been able to bring the Mozambique government and Renamo rebels together. They got them to the table in Rome at their own headquarters. But Sant'Egidio knew that they couldn't really pull this off unless they drew on the UN, the Italian government, the American government, the Department of Defense. They didn't know anything about negotiating a ceasefire and a demobilization process. So religious leaders need to work with secular leaders. I've already mentioned the fact that the spiritual dimension that is so critically important and can bring people together even when they are of different faiths and when those faiths are in hostile relations to each other. And I mentioned the story of Yasin and Froman, but I remember, these are not two people that are profiled in the book, but I remember a trip to Jerusalem once, meeting an ultra-Orthodox rabbi and a very conservative Muslim imam. And the rabbi said to me, "I feel closer to my Muslim friend than I do to secular Jews." And the imam said, "I feel the same way about secular Palestinians. I feel closer to this rabbi than I do to secular Palestinians." So there is the bond that spirituality can bring together, even if the particular tenets of the faith may differ. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. And just a couple of very brief thoughts that I'm reminded by these remarks and by the stories in the book that all of us can play different roles in dealing with conflict. One of my colleagues, Bill Urey, has written a book called The Third Side, where he identifies a lot of different roles that people can play who aren't parties in the conflict, as eyewitnesses, as journalists, as mediators, as arbitrators, as peacekeepers and bridge builders, witnesses, referees, healers. And just to think of all the roles that these 16 individuals played, some of them played several of these roles themselves, weren't just one thing. They were able to be flexible. And there's a project that Bill Urey is initiating called the Abraham Path Initiative. And the idea is to create a hiking and cultural trail from southern Turkey through Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, maybe someday with branches to Iran and Iraq. And it's already, there have been a few kilometers of it have been mapped out. And we were at some meetings in the Middle East last fall, and there were archaeologists there and historians and hikers. And so they have a role as well. And we've heard about the arts. So I just think they're wonderful opportunities, and I so agree with what you've said about Northern Ireland. You know, so much of the news is bad news, but there's really some good news now and again as well. So now we have a few minutes for quick questions or comments from any of you out there.
I'm just wondering, is there something sort of neurological in the primitive part of the human brain and psyche which makes peace essentially incompatible between conflicted parties? In other words, and I don't know the answer to this, but it's sort of like the human psyche perhaps can tolerate temporary periods of peace. So there's a mutual relief from the exhaustion of conflict. So if so, it may be that peace is kind of an unstable human condition. It's always possible, but never permanent. in a long view of history would seem to suggest something like this. Like in part, the problem is not entirely environmental, it's not entirely circumstantial, but there's something neurologically wired into the primitive brain which is continually producing conflict, and it does produce temporary periods of peace, but they never last. And history sort of suggests this as far back as you want to go. And again, it's a thought. I don't know what the answer is.
Does anybody
get the gist of
want to take that on? Are people wired not to support peace?
I just want to say one thing. When we were in New York at our last retreat, working with the Peace Council and the Dalai Lama's Peace Council, there was a theme which you actually just touched on, which is peace is possible. And I think that we have to, I don't have the answer to you about our biology, but I do think that it is possible and something that we need to keep defining with clarity. And I think there are a lot of paths to it, and there are some paths here that we've been talking about that are underutilized, and that if we learn to utilize more the different ways, we're more likely to have much more of it.
Up there?
Yes. As we're speaking about a conflict resolution from a religious angle as opposed to a secular, I'm struck by, in my experience, the role of what I would call Satan, or just a force of darkness, where people on the other side of the table are not straightforward. They are actually possessed. They're good people and possessed, or they're awful people, and their heart is dark. And okay, now evil is at work in the room. Now, we're secular people won't discuss this, but religious folks can. And I'm astonished to see that even people who have a religious view are quick to deny the role of evil, in conflict. And I think that we do so at our loss.
Anybody want to comment?
I'm not hesitant to talk about evil. I've been thinking about writing a book someday about when I was 10 years old. My favorite book was Wild Animals I Have Known. Now I'm thinking about writing a book about evil men, and that's not a gender-biased statement. It's only men that I've known. The evil men I have known, starting with Idi Amin. There is evil. We may have differing views about what the characteristic is, but when I talk about the Lord's Resistance Army, there's no other way to describe what they do but manifestations of evil. And there's a great deal of evil at work in many of these conflicts. Some of them are conflicts between good-hearted people who are not evil, but there's a great deal of evil, and I don't think any of us are hesitant to talk about evil.
Yeah. I believe there is a force in the cosmos that is evil. I don't crystallize it around some satanic entity, but God has created evil along with virtue to make us morally free agents. So each of us is capable of evil. Each of us has a spark of evil and a spark of divinity in us. And we have to choose. And what is, I think, the most serious problem is projecting onto whole groups of other people a demonic projection and then whitewashing your own sins. And this history is full of. So, just reflecting on Ivo's comments about how anti-Judaism and demonic projections onto Jews is just a long, sad reality in Western Christendom. Okay? And Western Christendom developed a whole dualistic cosmology more than maybe any other, certainly as much as any other religious tradition, and never shed light on its own shadow in this regard, vis-a-vis the Jews especially. So I'm wary and worried about invoking Satan as the kind of arch enemy of us all without taking responsibility for our own tendency to not just otherize and make into enemies people who are fighting us or don't like us the way we are, but to say they are children of darkness or children of the devil. This is a symbolic construct that we have. If we're hardwired for anything, we are symbolically gifted and cursed in this way, and we have to take responsibility for that.
First of all, thank you for such a stimulating panel.
Will you speak up?
Yeah, David Little mentioned that within the book there is some disagreement about the use of force in peacemaking. That's not my question. I was wondering whether there is a general consensus or disagreement about what happens in terms of forgiveness and reconciliation once there is peace. Is there a model that people gravitate towards, like, say, the South African Peace Commission, Truth Commission, or are there wide varieties that religious peacemakers approach this issue?
I've just been reflecting on the nature of political forgiveness, going beyond individual forgiveness. And there's a great deal of, I was amazed when I started digging into the literature, there's a great deal of literature on this that's already been written in some very thoughtful pieces. And it goes well beyond the South African experience. There's a great deal of debate about whether the South African experience was, how successful it was. And I think even Desmond Tutu will say there were shortcomings in that process, and I think he would be very reluctant to say this is a model that should be adopted in whole cloth throughout the world. So there are a variety of approaches. Individual circumstances have to be taken into consideration. Bosnia has been agonizing over this in recent years. What kind of truth commission, whether to have a truth commission, what it would look like, amnesty, what kind of amnesty, whether forgiveness has to be combined with justice through the international criminal courts. A great deal of very significant debates underway. So there's a rich literature, there's a lot of creative thinking going on in this, but I don't think anybody, however great the South African experience may have been, it's certainly not going to be the answer to all the world's problems.
Just to follow up on that, when I was in Bosnia working with the U.S. Institute of Peace, we started out with an interreligious discussion of leaders. And the Muslim leader in particular was very offended by the emphasis on reconciliation. He thought it was premature, was not relevant. We need to hear admissions of injustice and of violations before we can begin to move forward, which I think was not altogether incorrect. But it was interesting to observe over the months and even years in my contacts with those people. Eventually, this Muslim leader came to the position that some kind of forgiveness, reconciliation, is going to be required on the part of the victims in order to break the logjam, as it were. And this was quite an interesting education. I'm not sure that that's true in every case. There's deep tension about claims of justice and whether these are being satisfied if we move too quickly to forgive or to find new forms of reconciliation. But it's interesting in the interactions that people go through over time that they struggle, as it were, from simply asserting claims of justice to some other dimension of human interaction which transcends that, at least here and there.
Oh, sorry, did you want to say something? Just one more.
I wanted only to add what is forgiveness from perspective of the situation we have, post-war situation. In my opinion, it is first of all healing. The victims are dependent on criminals who injure them, and they look in past just to help them to normalize their life. That is healing. First of all, forgiveness is healing. And also I think always we take care on victims and heal them. We forget criminals. And that is also very, very important, enable to victims that justice functions, so it helps them. But also it is needed to help people who committed these crimes, because they have terrible consequences, and it is needed also heal them, so that we normalize situation. Very often the victims are in their situation because all our work helping victims in Bosnia. For criminals, they only take them in prisons and don't try to heal them. Sometimes it's interesting to meet also these people and heal them. So I like to speak more about healing than forgiveness is something.
Yeah. So, Lobsang?
My question is to the practitioners. I would like to know what life experience kind of triggered you to be practitioners. Is it just an accidental thing? You just went with the flow, it just happened, or something happened that triggered you to do things? And then in the process of doing it, what are the frustrations and obstacles and challenges that you face along, and sometimes question your faith, question your conviction, but then you continue. So if you could share some anecdotes and experience, that would be helpful.
Just a thought or two.
I think that in the profile on me in the book, I mentioned that an early crystallizing moment was the convergence of my bar mitzvah in September, October 1962, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was being inaugurated into adulthood, and the adults couldn't guarantee me a future. So I said, something's radically wrong with this picture. Okay? So that's kept me going, growing and going, and trying to dream a way out of this vicious cycle of either victims or victimizers. There's no third alternative. I believe that there is. That's part of my faith. And that is tested all the time. And I've heard too often from fellow Jews, we can't afford that kind of prophetic ethics until we win. Then we can be prophetically virtuous or something like that. Justice and compassion, that works, for winners. In the meantime, we're on the losing end of all kinds of threats, menaces, and he just named the latest villain, right? I don't have to mention names. But they are there. They are there. And the challenge for me as a Jew is not to fall into that trap of being the eternal victim. David Grossman has an absolutely powerful essay in yesterday's New York Times Magazine about how he writes in order to transcend the profile of him as an intractable enemy. If you grow up in a conflict situation, you are every moment of your life somebody's enemy. Even if you don't want to make enemies, they're making an enemy out of you. How do you live with that? And there are symbolic projections, and there are real injustices and sufferings and oppression going on. So there's reason to be hated also. That's the hardest thing to come to grips with. Somebody hates me not just because of a demonic projection. It's because my people continues to harm that person's people. And how you get out of that situation is a real test of faith for me.
Go ahead.
I just want to share something about Friar Ivo, and then maybe he'll speak about it. There was a time in the conflict when you lost members of your family. and you nonetheless went back to help everyone. You don't want to talk about it?
No, I can. So it was really terrible experience that I experienced with killing of my father, relatives, all my place where I was born was expelled. So it was one shock. In that moment, I was before engaged as peacemaker, trying to reconcile, to stop the war, and then I doubted, was my orientation okay? Perhaps I felt guilty. Perhaps I'm guilty, I'm naive, that so many people were killed. Perhaps I had to go to organize them, to protect them. Perhaps to take weapons. In such situations we have such temptation, really, it is very strong. In my personal experience, I'm a believer also, I pray. I found that I don't like this word evil, but sometimes these negative tendencies are very strong. We have to stop it. We have to react, do something to stop degradation of the life. I think that is something human, and that is especially if we, I would tell it, if we live in communication with grace, with experience of God, love of God, then I think this positive orientation is very easy. Very soon after this terrible experience, I decided to work. Just it was my escape from this terrible situation, to work, to transform energies of sadness to work positively, to reconcile people, to solve. And that is this transformation then is very it gives special strength, really, security in orientation. So it is not my experience. You can find so many people in such situation that they are very dedicated to peace, extremely positive, and so I find such people among Muslims there on all sides, and very often the victims start to be very often the stimulators of peace.
Thank you. Last one, and then we'll have Professor Swearer say something.
There you go. I want to ask a question about, is it true that during the war, was there one point in which you stood in front of a group that wanted to destroy a town? Is that true?
In front of?
A group that wanted to destroy a town.
When you went to the Muslim village.
So, yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a question about that moment.
Yeah.
What do you think, what happened in that moment in terms of you and the people in front of whom you were standing? What do you think they got from you? And what do you think, what happened between the two of you? Why did you stop?
It was in beginning of the war. From one side, there was people trying to put people in the war because they saw advantages to solve situation by violence. On the other side, we were many trying to stop it. And in that time, in the beginning of the war, I lived in Middle Bosnia, and impulses came from Serbian and Croatian side to make war with Muslims. And we tried to stop it directly. And I lived in one monastery in Middle Bosnia, trying to stop it. And in one moment, the war was something systematically done. The former Yugoslavia had 10,000 of people very educated in war, and they know how to do it through propaganda, then killing someone and so. And then between one Muslim Bosniak village and the Croatian Catholic village, they started to prepare just war. They prepared front lines. So, And then I took my Franciscan habit because it is a sign. Franciscans are very popular. Muslims and the Croats have trust to such people. I took this habit, and when I came to Croats Catholics, I said them, go from there, go to village. I expelled them. I had authority there. And then when on Muslim side, they endangered me to kill me if I go. And then I said to kill me. In that moment, it was beginning of the war. In the war, I would be killed, 100%. But in the beginning of the war, I had chance. I had authority to calm them, to expel them from there, to take their weapons, to bring them to reconciliation. It was not enmity so deep. Later, when war is very strong, then on other side is only enemy, and therefore they kill, regardless soldiers or children or unmovable people. So they kill all. It is human beings in the war are reduced just as fighting dogs, animals, and so that is very difficult to stop. Then it is needed to stop the war, to divide people. You had to come from United States to divide us in such situation. Yeah.
Well, before we thank all our panelists, would you like to say a few words?
My principal function is really to thank the panel for a very stimulating and inspiring hour and a half. We're very, very grateful for this. And a number of other people I would like to thank, too. I'd like to begin with David Little, with whom I've worked now as director of the center for 3 years. David worked very closely. We worked very closely together in planning a conference my first year as director of the center on religion and nationalism. In fact, since the Tanenbaum Center is plugging their book, I should plug ours as well. The conference was on religion and nationalism in Iraq, a comparative perspective, and we looked comparatively with Iraq at Bosnia, the Sudan, and Iraq. And I must say that, as what has been pointed out in the discussion, that it is difficult not to be overwhelmed by the negative role that religion often plays in conflict situations. The ones that we looked at, these sort of incendiary ingredients of religion, ethnicity, place, and nationalism are oftentimes very problematic. And perhaps it was in part as a result of that conference and that experience that this year at the center, our thematic programming dealt also with issues of authority and conflict in world religions, but we wanted to do something in our spring conference that focused specifically and more particularly on peace and peacemaking. And this kickoff event for our conference tomorrow, which is closed, and to a group of invited guests. So I want to thank then specifically the Tanenbaum Center for being one of the hosts of this kickoff event for the conference tomorrow. I'd like also to thank very much Mark Gopin, the director of the Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. They are also one of our co-sponsors, and particularly then Scott Appleby, the director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and of course Susan Hackley for being a part of this as the managing director of the program on negotiation at the Harvard Law School. And I'd like to just make one comment about what I see as being the significance of these co-sponsors, not just the practical aspect of it, which indeed is important, that we have co-sponsorship by various organizations, but for what it represents, because for me at least, it not only represents the role of the center in a network of relationships that we try to build among people and among institutions, but more generally the importance of working together, of collaboration, of cooperation, of networking, that clearly one of the keys to peacemaking, whether we're dealing among religious groups and authorities or between religious groups and authorities and secular groups and authorities, that without collaboration and cooperation there will never be peace in any kind of conflict situation. So I'm not only grateful to Susan and Mark and Scott and David for being a part of this event, but for what I hope it represents in a broader sense. Just one word about the closed conference for a group of invited participants tomorrow. It is titled Visions of Peace and Reconciliation in World Religions, Historical and Contemporary Patterns. And this is the kind of thing that we try to do at the Center in terms of having thematic programming during the year, which culminates in a conference in the spring, and then some kind of publication as a result after that. The Center itself, just one word about it for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Center. It is part of the Divinity School. It was opened as a building across the street, a kind of low two-story building. If you're not familiar with it, you may miss it, so please take a look at it. But it was opened 46 years ago, and it was open for the purpose of promoting the teaching of world religions at the Divinity School at a time when it was principally a Protestant seminary. Over the years, the Center has had some very distinguished directors. It has made a very important contribution, I think, to our understanding of world religions and interreligious understanding, not only in this country, but really around the world. So it's a pleasure, and I speak now as the director of the Center, to have all of you here at this event. And I hope you will join me in expressing our thanks to the panelists for a stimulating